The galaxy had been quiet for centuries, the kind of silence that made the stars seem eternal and unshakable. The alien empire ruled everything between the burning suns and frozen voids. Their fleets were unmatched, their soldiers feared, their banners shining like golden fire across hundreds of systems. No one dared to speak against them. No one even dreamed of standing in their way. Their history was written in the crushed bones of those who tried. The empire believed it was forever, that its power was endless, that no shadow could rise where its light burned. But shadows always wait in silence, and silence can speak louder than armies. It began as a flicker on a border patrol vessel, a weak pulse of energy on a quiet shift. The crew thought it was a glitch in their sensors. The outer rim was known for strange echoes, drifting signals from old wars and forgotten satellites. But this was different. It wasn't random static. It was one pure tone. The communications officer leaned closer, trying to adjust the frequency. The pulse grew stronger, sharper, until it cut through every channel like a blade through glass. All across the ship, alarms began to blink. The captain barked orders, but the crew couldn't explain it. The signal wasn't coming from any direction. It was everywhere and nowhere at once. The message carried no sound, no image, no face, just words written in every known language of the galaxy. 3 words. Simple. Calm. Icy. We are awake. The captain stared at the screen, unsure if it was a threat or a joke. But deep down, something cold moved in his chest. Empires are built on fear, and fear often recognizes its own shadow before the mind admits it. Within minutes, the same message appeared on hundreds of ships. Then thousands. It reached deep into the core systems where the Empire's banners waved proudly over glittering cities. Every commander received it at the same time. Every communication officer reported the same impossible fact. There was no origin. It was like the message had been born from the darkness itself. No beacon, no transmitter, no trace. It was as if the void had decided to speak. The High Command gathered in their fortified station above the central star. The room was filled with admirals and council members, their faces shining with the arrogance of centuries of power. Some laughed, calling it a prank from rebels. Some said it was a lost transmission bouncing around from some forgotten corner of space. Others, the older ones who remembered wars long buried in history, stayed quiet. Because deep down, they knew that nothing in the void spoke without purpose. Across the Empire's core worlds, people stopped and stared at the message that appeared on every public screen. Markets went silent. Spaceports froze. Children whispered it like a secret they didn't understand. We are awake. No threats. No demands. Just a whisper that shook the foundations of their certainty. The signal didn't fade. It grew louder. Stronger. More real. It echoed through their ships, through their cities, through the stars themselves. It came from places that didn't exist on their maps. It came from between the stars, from the places they never looked because they believed nothing was there. The Empire responded the way all empires do. They sent fleets. They sent their strongest ships to the edges of the outer rim, scanning every asteroid, every moon, every dead world. But there was nothing. No station. No ship. No base. Only silence. But the signal kept repeating, calm and endless. We are awake. Fear began to spread, quiet and hidden at first. Soldiers started whispering in the halls of their ships. Commanders ordered extra patrols even when there was nothing to find. Small border colonies began to panic, locking down ports, closing markets, shutting down trade routes. They didn't know who was speaking, but they could feel the storm building in the dark. A storm that didn't care about their fleets or their flags. On a moon station far from the core, a young officer named Rian stood alone in the observation deck. He had grown up hearing stories of the Empire's endless power. He had seen fleets move like silver dragons through the stars. But as he stared at the endless black outside, he felt small for the first time. He couldn't explain it, but the message didn't sound like rebellion. It didn't sound like warlords. It sounded older. Like something that had been here long before the Empire's ships lit their engines for the first time. The scientists worked around the clock, tearing apart data streams, searching for clues. They found something they couldn't explain. The signal wasn't just one message. It carried layers beneath it. Hidden frequencies buried deep inside. Frequencies that matched no known technology, no known race. Some of the patterns were older than the Empire itself. Some didn't belong to anything recorded in their history. It was like listening to a voice from before they were born. Panic grew inside the council even if they didn't show it outside. The speaker slammed his hand on the table, demanding answers. But there were none. Their scanners couldn't find it. Their ships couldn't track it. Their minds couldn't understand it. For the first time in centuries, the Empire faced something it couldn't control. And control was everything. The signal began to bend reality itself. Ships near the edges of the rim reported strange phenomena. Navigation systems twisted, making their maps useless. Time delays increased. Crew members claimed to see shadows moving on the scanners. Entire patrol fleets began to go silent without warning. At first, the council blamed pirates, then rebels. But soon they could no longer deny it. Something vast was moving in the darkness. The citizens of the Empire began to whisper. They whispered of the old war, the one that was never written in the history books. A war fought not with the races of the stars but with something else. Something that vanished before the Empire was born. Some said it was just myth. Some said it was legend. But the whispers matched the message. We are awake. The first starport to shut down was on the edge of the Ziran belt. It happened without warning. One moment, ships were docked and lights filled the sky. The next moment, the entire station was silent. No calls, no lights, no signs of struggle. It was like the place had been erased. Fleets sent to investigate found nothing but floating dust. The Empire's golden pride began to crack. Commanders grew restless. Governors started demanding protection. The High Speaker ordered a massive security alert across all systems. Fleets were recalled. Borders were sealed. But the signal didn't care. It went deeper, stronger, louder. It was no longer a whisper. It was a storm. In the void, beyond the edges of their empire, something old was opening its eyes. They didn't know it yet, but the galaxy they ruled was no longer theirs alone. The sleeping giant they had ignored for centuries had finally awakened. It didn't need to show its face. Its voice was enough to make the stars themselves tremble. And as the Empire struggled to understand the threat, the humans, those forgotten, dismissed, and underestimated, watched from their hidden fortresses in the cold darkness. They had waited long enough. Now, the game was theirs. The council chamber above the central star was a place where no one dared to speak without permission. It was built of black stone and gold, a monument to power that had stood untouched for centuries. Here, the High Speaker and the Council of Lords made decisions that shaped the fate of entire star systems, and tonight, their voices rose like thunder. The message that had spread across every fleet and planet had shaken them more than they wanted to admit. Their empire had crushed every enemy, burned every rebellion, erased every threat. But this was different. This enemy had no face, no army, no fleet. Only a voice that came from the void itself, calm and cold, repeating again and again, "We are awake." The arrogance that once filled the chamber cracked slightly beneath the weight of the unknown. The High Speaker stood tall, his crimson robes falling over the marble steps. His voice boomed through the hall, demanding control, demanding silence. "It is nothing," he declared, his eyes hard as steel. "A trick. A phantom. Some forgotten race trying to make itself known. We are the Empire. No voice in the dark can challenge us." His words were powerful, but they did not stop the quiet unease spreading through the room like smoke. The admirals shifted in their seats. The governors avoided each other's eyes. Everyone felt the chill even if no one wanted to admit it. An old admiral with silver scales stood from his chair, his voice slower but sharper than the speaker's. "We have lost 3 patrol fleets on the outer rim. No debris, no signals, nothing. This is not a game, Speaker. We may not be facing some small pirate group. Something out there is moving faster than we can see." The chamber grew silent at his words. They all knew he was not a man to speak lightly. He had seen wars when most of them were still children. If he was worried, they should have been terrified. But power makes fools believe they are untouchable. A young governor with gold-plated armor rose, laughing loud enough for the walls to echo. "You fear ghosts," he said, his voice filled with pride. "We have the strongest fleets in the galaxy. Our weapons can burn worlds. If something is out there, we will crush it as we have crushed everything before." Others clapped, eager to hide their fear behind arrogance. The speaker nodded, feeding on their pride like a predator pretending to be calm. But deep down, in the dark corners of their minds, the fear was growing like a silent fire. Outside the chamber, the Empire moved with noise and light, trying to drown out the whisper. Fleets were ordered to every edge of the border. Scout ships flew through empty systems, scanning for anything that moved. Generals barked commands, engineers upgraded defense grids, and news channels spread carefully crafted lies to keep the people calm. They told them it was a false signal, a technical mistake, an old transmitter waking up from the past. But the people weren't fools. They saw the fleets moving like storms. They saw soldiers rushing to stations. They heard the silence behind the loud speeches. On the military station orbiting the Red Crescent Nebula, Commander Sealer stood before a massive holomap of the border. Tiny red dots blinked where patrols had gone dark. It wasn't just 3 fleets anymore. It was 6. 6 entire fleets, erased without a single warning. No explosion. No mayday. Just gone. She clenched her jaw, feeling the weight of something ancient pressing down on the stars. She had fought pirates, rebels, rogue fleets, but never something that erased entire armadas like smoke in the wind. She turned to her officers, their faces pale beneath the blue lights of the command bridge. "This is not a drill," she said quietly. "This is a hunt. And we are the prey." Back in the capital, the council released its official statement, filled with bold words and hollow threats. They said no one would dare stand against the Empire. They said their fleets would hunt the shadow down. But words were just wind, and the galaxy could feel the wind changing direction. Border colonies began to lock down their gates. Trade ships refused to travel. Whisper networks grew louder than the official broadcasts. Fear spreads faster than war. In the slums of the mining world Torkan 7, workers huddled around broken screens, whispering about the message. Some thought it was a god returning. Others thought it was the end. They were far from the capital, far from the golden halls of the speaker, and they could feel the darkness moving closer every night. A transport pilot who once carried smuggled goods to the outer rim swore he saw a black ship the size of a mountain, floating silently past the asteroid fields. It didn't fire. It didn't move. It just watched. The council refused to believe it. They increased patrols, pushing their fleets deeper into the unknown, believing their numbers would make the shadow bend. But every day another fleet went silent. Every day the message grew louder, clearer, almost like it was mocking them. "We are awake." It didn't come from one place anymore. It came from everywhere at once, like a heartbeat spreading through the stars. The speaker's advisors whispered that they should prepare for war. But the speaker didn't listen. Empires don't like to accept that something stronger exists. Empires don't like to look into the mirror and see a predator staring back. He ordered the council to show no weakness, to crush any talk of panic, to remind the galaxy who ruled. Banners of the Empire were raised across every city. Their grand fleets lined up like steel dragons in orbit. But even dragons bleed when they meet something older. In a dark corner of the galaxy, beneath the frozen moons of Europa, far beyond the Empire's reach, a hidden command center came alive. Lights flickered. Engines hummed. Terran symbols glowed on screens older than most alien civilizations. Humanity, forgotten and ignored, watched the Empire stumble in the dark. They had waited centuries for this moment, watching silently from the shadows of dead stars, learning every weakness, every blind spot. The Empire thought it ruled everything. They were wrong. The Council might have laughed, the fleets might have flown, and the colonies might have whispered, but the humans were no longer sleeping. The shadow the Empire feared wasn't just something in the dark. It was already moving. It was already here. And the aliens, wrapped in the comfort of their own arrogance, still didn't understand the truth. They were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. The first fleet disappeared without a trace, and the Empire called it a malfunction. The second vanished, and they called it sabotage. But when the third fleet went dark, the whispers became screams. The border worlds, once calm under Imperial rule, turned into nests of fear. No one saw what struck those ships. No distress beacons. No escape pods. Just silence, deep and cold, like the stars themselves had swallowed the fleet's whole. Admirals barked orders, commanders scanned every corner of the void, but the black around them stayed silent, watching. For centuries the Empire had been the predator. Now it felt like prey, and it didn't know how to breathe in the dark anymore. On a distant observation station near the edge of the Outer Rim, a young technician leaned over his console, his hands shaking as strange patterns appeared on his screen. Lines of static twisted into shapes that made no sense, like someone was drawing in the darkness with invisible hands. The readings were impossible, energy signatures that didn't match any known race, moving faster than anything the Empire had ever built. He opened his mouth to call the captain, but the lights flickered once, twice, and everything went black. In the last second before the station went silent forever, he saw a shadow move outside the viewport. It had no shape, no lights, only size, vast and endless, stretching across the stars like something that had always been there, just waiting. The council tried to control the panic, but panic doesn't listen to speeches. Reports came in from every sector. Trade convoys lost contact. Outposts went dark. Civilian ships drifted back into friendly space with their crews gone, their hulls untouched, like something had reached inside and simply taken life away. The high speaker still stood tall, shouting about strength, about control, but even his generals avoided his gaze now. They had seen the maps. They knew how fast the silence was spreading. It wasn't random. It wasn't chaos. It was moving with purpose, circling the Empire like a predator stalking its prey. On the moon fortress of Karun, Admiral Relos watched the border through a wall of glass. He had commanded fleets for decades, crushed rebellions, burned planets, and never feared anything. But tonight, as he stared at the stars, his hands would not stop shaking. He remembered an old story told in military schools, a legend buried deep in the Empire's archives, of a race that once walked among the stars and disappeared before the Empire was born. No one believed it anymore. It was a bedtime story meant to frighten cadets. But the way the signal moved, the way the darkness swallowed ships without leaving a trace, it matched the old stories too well. He whispered to himself without realizing it, "It's them, it's real." Patrol ships launched from Karun Fortress, hundreds of them, their engines blazing bright as they scattered across the void. For a few hours the sensors showed nothing, only silence. Then, one by one, the dots on the Admiral's map began to blink out. No explosions. No cries for help. Just one small flash of static each time, like a candle being blown out by an invisible wind. Officers shouted, alarms wailed, but no one knew what they were fighting. The terror was not in the violence, but in the absence of it. There was no battle. There was no war. There was only something vast and unseen pulling the Empire's strength apart like threads. The panic bled down to the lower worlds. Border colonies that once trusted Imperial fleets started locking their gates, refusing to answer hails. Smugglers and traders abandoned routes. Governors fled their posts, leaving entire planets leaderless. And through it all, the message never stopped. It whispered through every channel, through every screen, soft as a breath, cold as the void. We are awake. It didn't roar like a conqueror. It didn't threaten like a rebel. It spoke like something that had no need to prove itself, because it already knew it was stronger. In the military barracks of the Empire's most powerful fleet, soldiers whispered in the dark. These were men and women who had seen war, who had marched through fire and blood without fear. But this was different. Fear of an enemy you can see is one thing. Fear of something that can erase entire fleets without being seen is another. One soldier told the others he saw a black ship once, during his patrol near the Broken Star Belt. He said it had no engines, no markings, and it glided like a shadow across the stars. He had thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Now, no one was sure anymore. On a secret monitoring station far from the Council's eyes, a small group of analysts finally cracked a part of the signal. It wasn't just a warning. It wasn't just noise. It was coordinates. Ancient coordinates pointing to empty space outside the known star maps. The analysts sent their report to High Command. High Command buried it immediately. They didn't want the Council or the public to know. Because those coordinates didn't belong to empty space. They belonged to something erased from history long ago. They belonged to Earth. Meanwhile, in the deep dark, human warships moved like ghosts. Black hulls absorbed starlight, engines silent, weapons armed. They didn't need to send messages or show themselves. The Empire's own fear was doing the work for them. For centuries they had watched the alien empire grow fat and arrogant. They had learned its defenses, its roots, its weaknesses. Humanity had stayed silent for a reason. Now, the time for silence was ending. The Council tried to hold the illusion of control, but cracks were spreading like spider webs through their perfect golden structure. The speaker stood before the galaxy, declaring victory before the war even began. But even as he spoke, fleets continued to vanish, colonies continued to fall silent, and the whisper from the void grew louder. We are awake. In the eyes of the Empire, the enemy was a ghost. In truth, it was far worse. It was humanity, patient, calculating, and ready to strike. And the aliens, who once thought themselves the rulers of the galaxy, didn't even know where the storm was coming from. They only felt its breath on the back of their necks. The hunt had begun. The Empire's fleets gathered like storm clouds at the edge of the outer rim, their golden banners lighting the dark with arrogance. Massive warships drifted in formation, their engines glowing like suns, their commanders speaking in proud, cold voices. They believed their power could crush anything. For centuries, no one had ever challenged them and lived. They had conquered, burned, erased. But as their ships pushed into the void where the signals came from, something inside their flawless order began to shake. The space ahead of them was wrong, not broken, not empty, just wrong. Navigation systems flickered, maps twisted, scanners showed nothing but endless darkness. It felt like stepping into a mouth that never closed. On the flagship Imperial Dawn, Admiral Relos stood at the bridge with his hands behind his back, staring at the black horizon. He had spent his whole life commanding fleets, had seen planets fall and enemies beg. But tonight the void felt different. It wasn't silent. It was listening. His officers barked updates, but their voices carried cracks of fear. The fleets had arrived in perfect formation. Now, one by one, their instruments began to lose contact with each other. Ships just a few kilometers apart suddenly showed no readings at all, as if space itself had swallowed them. No explosion. No warning. Just gone. The Admiral ordered the long-range scanners to full power. The entire ship shuddered as energy poured into the system. For a moment, the black veil ahead seemed to ripple like water, and the crew froze. Something was moving. It wasn't a single object, or a ship. It was massive, larger than anything the Empire had ever built, hidden inside the darkness like a predator hiding in deep water. The crew held their breath. The Admiral's voice was steady, but his heart hammered in his chest. All ships, battle readiness, he commanded, and the order echoed across thousands of vessels. Weapons charged, shields rose, engines burned hotter. But against what? No one knew. Then the stars disappeared. Every light on the horizon dimmed as a wall of shadow slowly emerged, blacker than the void itself. It moved without sound, without heat, without any signature their senses could recognize. One moment the Empire's fleet faced empty space. The next, they faced an entire armada that had been waiting for centuries. Terran warships stepped out of the dark like old gods returning to a forgotten battlefield. Their hulls were pure black, covered in silver scars that caught the starlight like teeth. No signals. No banners. No names. Just power. The Empire's commanders shouted, their fleet scrambling to form firing lines. The Admiral raised his hand. Fire, he ordered. Thousands of beams, missiles, and cannons lit up the void. The stars burned with the fury of their attack. But when the light faded, nothing had changed. The Terran fleet stood untouched. Not a scratch. Their ships absorbed everything like the darkness itself had swallowed the Empire's rage. And then came the sound. A single deep pulse echoed through every ship, not through speakers, not through comms, but through the hull itself. A heartbeat. One loud, slow, terrifying heartbeat. Before the Empire's fleet could fire again, the Terran warships moved. They didn't charge like the Empire expected. They didn't roar. They glided. Fast. Precise. Silent. Entire squadrons disappeared in seconds, erased without any trace. Weapons that had crushed star systems failed to even touch their hulls. Panic tore through the fleet like a storm through glass. Captains screamed into dead comms, engines flared in every direction, ships tried to retreat, but the void offered no escape. For centuries the Empire had been the hunter. Now it was cornered prey in its own territory. On the Imperial dawn, the Admiral gripped the edge of the command table, his knuckles white. The scanners showed Terran ships moving in patterns too perfect, too fast, like they weren't fighting but simply cleaning. He tried to hail them, to demand surrender, to threaten. There was no response. Only that slow, echoing heartbeat. He turned to his officers, their faces pale, their voices breaking. "We've underestimated them," someone whispered, and the Admiral knew those words were true. Across the Empire, news of the battle broke like a thunderclap. At first, the Council tried to control it, to call it a skirmish. But soon even they couldn't hide it. An entire fleet, one of their strongest, was gone. Erased in less than an hour. No survivors. No wreckage. Just a black mark on their star map. Panic consumed the border worlds. Colonies abandoned Imperial banners. Traders refused to move. Soldiers began to whisper what the Council would not say aloud. The enemy wasn't just strong. The enemy was beyond them. Meanwhile, in the shadows of a forgotten solar system, beneath the ice of Europa, the human command center pulsed with quiet precision. Terran admirals stood around a massive holotable, their expressions calm. They had watched, waited, studied this empire for hundreds of years. They knew every fleet formation, every weapon range, every weak point. And now, with their first step, they had shown the galaxy the truth. Humanity had never been weak. It had never disappeared. It had simply been waiting. The humans didn't celebrate the victory. They didn't need to. The message had been delivered louder than any broadcast. The Empire's most powerful fleet had fallen without a single Terran casualty. The Council would call meetings, scream for answers, threaten retaliation. It didn't matter. This was not a war the aliens could win with noise and power. This was a storm they couldn't stop. Humanity had been patient for too long, and now its shadow stretched across the stars. Admiral Relos stared at the darkness that had swallowed his fleet. For the first time in his long career, he had no strategy, no answer. No escape. The Terran fleet moved again, faster than thought, like a black tide closing in. In the final moment before his ship fell silent, he realized something terrible. The Empire had never truly ruled this galaxy. They had been living in someone else's shadow the entire time. Humanity had never been gone. Humanity had only been silent. And silence, when it wakes, is louder than war. The Empire had always believed its fleets were invincible. For centuries they had marched across the stars like gods, crushing anyone who dared to rise. But after the Battle of the Outer Rim, their golden illusion shattered like glass. The most powerful fleet in their history was gone, erased in less than an hour, and the enemy didn't even announce its victory. The void itself had carried the message. Entire systems watched the silent return of a few broken escape pods drifting like ghosts. No one came back whole. The survivors spoke in trembling voices about black ships that moved like shadows, about weapons that melted shields like wax, about an enemy that never spoke, never roared, just destroyed. The Council tried to bury the truth, but fear has a way of finding every corner of the galaxy. The High Speaker stood before his council, his voice loud, his hands shaking behind the golden podium. He called the loss a setback, a surprise attack, a temporary weakness. But everyone in the chamber knew the truth. Pride was their shield, and it was cracking. One of the governors slammed his fist on the table and shouted that the border worlds were already preparing to surrender. Another demanded to negotiate. But the speaker's eyes burned with rage. Empires do not beg, he said. Empires do not kneel. They will fight. But even as he spoke, no one in the room truly believed him. They had seen what was out there. On the border colonies, chaos spread like a wildfire that no one could control. Civilian ships fled from the edges of space, leaving everything behind. Merchants abandoned their cargo. Families locked their homes and ran toward the core systems. Some colonies raised white banners before a single human ship appeared, choosing fear over resistance. They didn't need to see the fleet again. One battle was enough. The Terran fleet had shown them what kind of war was coming. It wasn't loud. It wasn't slow. It was precise, clean, and unstoppable. In the heart of the Empire's capital, the elite military command gathered in their underground war room. Holomaps flickered with red zones spreading across the outer sectors like blood seeping through cloth. Each red mark wasn't a battle. It was a disappearance. Entire defense fleets gone. Outposts erased. Supply lines cut. The Empire had spent centuries building fortresses, but those fortresses were built to fight what they understood. And this enemy was nothing they understood. One general stood up, shouting that the Terrans had to be outnumbered. The Empire controlled thousands of ships, more than any race in the galaxy. But numbers meant nothing against an enemy that struck like a blade in the dark. The High Command decided to send 5 more fleets. 5 full fleets carrying their best ships, their strongest admirals, their deadliest weapons. The Council called it the Iron Response, a final strike meant to crush the human shadow before it spread. Every channel in the Empire repeated the same line, "The enemy will fall." But the soldiers on those ships didn't believe it. They had heard the whispers from the survivors. They had seen the recordings, black shapes moving faster than sensors could follow, ships dying without a sound. As they boarded their vessels, none of them cheered. They just stared at the dark horizon, quiet, as if they were walking toward their own graves. In the cold void of space, far away from the Empire's shining cities, the Terran fleet drifted like a black storm. Thousands of warships hung in silence, their engines quiet, their weapons armed. No lights, no signals, just a wall of darkness waiting. Deep inside the flagship, human commanders stood around a war table. Their faces were calm, their voices low. They didn't talk about victory. They talked about timing. Every move, every strike, every disappearance had been part of a larger plan. They hadn't attacked to win a single battle. They had attacked to unmake an empire. As the 5 Imperial fleets entered the dark sector, their communication channels filled with noise, interference, and static. The admirals barked orders, but their voices cracked with fear they tried to hide. This time, they came prepared with more firepower than ever before. But the void didn't care about their weapons. The heartbeat came again. Deep, slow, shaking every hull at once. The same sound that had echoed in the first battle. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. The darkness shifted. Terran warships appeared without a flash, without a flare, like shadows stepping out of a nightmare. Hundreds became thousands in seconds. The Empire's admirals froze for a heartbeat too long, and that was enough. The Terrans moved with perfect precision, like they had already predicted every Imperial maneuver before it began. Entire squadrons disappeared in silence. Their best weapons didn't even leave a scratch. Every Imperial missile died before reaching its target. Every beam broke against black armor that absorbed light itself. And one by one, the fleets began to break. The admirals shouted, the soldiers screamed, the engines burned hot, but it didn't matter. The Empire had built its strength on fear, but now they were the ones drowning in it. Panic spread faster than their weapons could fire. Ships collided trying to escape. Commanders gave conflicting orders. The formation shattered like glass under a hammer. The humans didn't need to overwhelm them with numbers. They cut their fleets apart with surgical precision, piece by piece, until the dark sector was nothing but wreckage floating silently in the void. The High Speaker watched from his golden tower as the last signals from the iron response flickered and died. He clenched his fists so tightly that blood ran down his palms. For the first time in centuries, the Empire had no answer. No counterattack. No plan. The Terrans had not just defeated them, they had broken them. And worse, they had done it without a single speech, without a single demand, without even revealing their faces. Back on the Terran flagship, the human admiral watched the final Imperial ships vanish from the scanners. Around him, the bridge crew worked in silence, calm and steady. To them, this was not glory. This was inevitability. They had built their strength in the shadows while the Empire laughed at them, calling them extinct, weak, forgotten. Now the galaxy would learn a different truth. Humanity had never been weak. It had simply been patient. And now that patience had become a blade that could cut through empires. The High Speaker tried to speak to the Council, but his words failed him. No amount of golden speeches could hide the truth anymore. Entire sectors were gone, and the Terran fleet was unstoppable. The fear that had once served the Empire now belonged to humanity. And somewhere, in the cold black between the stars, the human voice whispered again. Not in anger, not in rage, but with calm, unshakable certainty. We are awake. The council chamber was no longer filled with the proud, booming voices that once ruled the galaxy. It was filled with the sound of fear, the kind of fear that crawls beneath the skin and never lets go. Holoscreens flickered all around, showing map after map stained with spreading red shadows. Imperial fleets erased, colonies abandoned, entire sectors silent. The Empire's mighty walls were not crumbling. They were already gone, and everyone in that room knew it. The High Speaker's hands trembled as he held onto the edge of the golden table, his eyes burning with the last flame of arrogance. But arrogance meant nothing now, because the Terrans didn't care about their speeches or their titles. They didn't want to negotiate or parade their power. They had already taken everything without asking for permission. Governors shouted over each other, some demanding surrender, others screaming for vengeance, and some simply begging for a plan, any plan. But the generals stood like statues, their faces pale, their throats tight. For the first time in living memory, no one had a strategy. Empires are built on control, and control was gone, ripped away like a flag in a storm. The High Speaker slammed his fist down, the sound echoing like a desperate heartbeat in the silent room. He shouted that the humans would be destroyed, that they were nothing but a forgotten race, that the Empire would crush them as they had crushed so many others. But everyone in the chamber had already seen what happened to the iron response. 5 entire fleets, gone without leaving even debris behind. The speaker's words were wind. The truth was already written in the stars. On the capital world, the panic reached the streets. People crowded spaceports, pushing and shouting, trying to get onto ships that had no destination. Broadcasts ran 24 hours a day, but every lie the council told only made the fear worse. Merchants packed their cargo, soldiers deserted their posts, planetary governors fled in the night, abandoning entire cities to chaos. The people had stopped believing in their empire. They no longer looked at their golden banners with pride. They looked at them like the funeral cloth of a dying age. In the military command centers buried deep beneath the surface, generals gathered around dark maps, whispering. They spoke not like conquerors but like men standing on a burning bridge. They had tried everything. They sent fleets, they tried weapons, they used strategies older than their own empire. Nothing worked. Every formation, every defense, every line they drew, the Terrans tore through it like it wasn't even there. It wasn't a war. It was a dismantling. The Empire wasn't fighting an enemy. It was watching itself be unmade piece by a hand that had been waiting in the shadows for centuries. And far away from their panic, in the cold black sea between the stars, humanity moved with quiet precision. Terran warships drifted like black wolves in the night, their engines silent, their weapons sleeping, because they didn't need to rush. They were not fighting to win a battle. They were claiming what had always been theirs. In the command center of the Terran flagship, the human admiral stood tall before a holoprojection of the entire galactic map. Red lines marked every imperial route, every fleet, every weak point. Humanity had mapped their empire long before the Empire ever thought of them as a threat. The Admiral didn't smile. This was not joy. This was the moment they had prepared for all their lives. The Empire launched its final defense, a desperate wall of warships surrounding the capital system. It was supposed to be an iron shield, an unbreakable line. Thousands of ships waited in perfect formation, their cannons armed, their commanders breathing hard behind steel masks of false courage. They told themselves they could still fight. They told themselves they could still win. But deep down, they already knew how it would end. The darkness came like a tide. The first Terran ships appeared on the edges of the system, black against the stars, silent as death. Then more came. Dozens. Hundreds. Thousands. The Imperial fleet opened fire in blind panic, turning the void into a storm of light. But once again, their power meant nothing. Terran warships moved like shadows, cutting through the lines without effort, weapons striking with surgical precision. Imperial ships burned like paper in a furnace, entire squadrons vanishing in seconds. The heartbeat returned, deep and steady, echoing through every hull, through every mind. Soldiers dropped their weapons. Captains screamed for retreat. But there was nowhere left to run. Inside the capital, the council watched the fall unfold in real time. The High Speaker stood in silence, the golden mask of power finally breaking. He whispered to himself that this couldn't be happening, that no one could destroy the Empire. But humanity wasn't destroying them with rage. They were dismantling them with patience, the same patience they had used for centuries, waiting in the dark while the Empire grew fat and arrogant. This wasn't revenge. This was inevitability. The first Terran ship broke through the outer ring of defense like a blade through silk. It didn't need to announce itself. Its black hull reflected no light, and yet every Imperial soldier who saw it understood what it meant. It was the beginning of the end. More Terran ships followed, their formation perfect, their silence louder than any war cry. No negotiations. No demands. Just the quiet advance of something the aliens should have feared long ago. In the streets of the capital, people fell to their knees, staring up at the black shadows cutting through the sky. Some cried. Some prayed. Some simply stood in silence, knowing their empire was gone. In orbit, Imperial ships that hadn't been destroyed surrendered without firing a shot. Admirals ordered their crews to shut down weapons. Even the loyalists who swore they'd fight to the last breath lowered their banners. Because fighting something like this wasn't war. It was suicide. In the Terran flagship, the Admiral stood before the glowing map as the last of the Imperial defenses fell. His second-in-command asked if they should broadcast a message. The Admiral's answer was quiet, almost like a whisper. We already did. The whisper that had started in the outer rim had reached the heart of the Empire. The galaxy had heard it. The Empire had felt it. We are awake. The High Speaker fell to his knees in the council chamber, his golden robes pooling around him like a dying flame. The age of the Empire ended not with fire and screaming, but with silence and shadow. Humanity didn't need to roar. The galaxy already knew. The Terran fleet filled the skies of the alien capital like a black storm swallowing the sun, and for the first time in centuries, the Empire was silent. No ships fired. No banners waved. The golden towers that once shined across the galaxy were now buried in the shadow of something far older, far stronger. The High Speaker stood in the council chamber, staring at the massive screens showing the Terran armada circling their world like a silent noose. The Empire had built its power on fear, but fear now belonged to humanity. All the words they had spoken over centuries meant nothing. All their fleets, their weapons, their pride had fallen like dry leaves in a storm. They had called themselves rulers of the galaxy, but they were never rulers. They were only guests. Humanity had been the storm that watched them grow fat and arrogant, waiting for the day to return. On the ground, the city was a sea of chaos. Citizens ran through the streets, ships fled into the upper atmosphere only to be surrounded by black silhouettes that didn't even bother to fire. The Empire's soldiers, once proud and feared, laid down their weapons one by one. None of them wanted to die fighting something they couldn't even touch. The Terran warships didn't broadcast threats or orders. They didn't demand surrender. They just existed, a wall of unstoppable darkness that made resistance meaningless. The sound of engines filled the sky, deep and low, like a storm rolling through the bones of the planet. The people didn't need to be told they had lost. They could feel it in the air. In the war room beneath the council chamber, generals and admirals huddled around a dying holo table. Red lights blinked like wounds across their star map. Every world, every fleet, every fortress had fallen. They tried to talk, to plan, to whisper strategies, but their voices broke into silence because none of it mattered anymore. The Terrans had already cut every path, blocked every escape, broken every line of defense. Their empire wasn't standing, it was just waiting to be buried. The High Speaker finally left his golden throne and walked toward the main balcony of the council tower. From there, he could see the sky filled with Terran ships, vast black shapes stretching from one horizon to the other. His empire had forced thousands of worlds to kneel. But today, they were the ones on their knees. He clenched the rail, his old hands trembling. He had spent his whole life believing that their empire was untouchable. Now, staring into the face of silent power, he realized something bitter and cold. This enemy didn't come to negotiate, didn't come to boast, didn't come to be praised. It came to end the empire, like a hunter ends a wounded beast. In orbit, the Terran flagship hung above the capital like a shadow covering the sun. Inside, the human admiral stood at the command bridge, surrounded by silent officers. No cheers, no victory songs, no celebration. This was never about glory. It was about balance. For centuries, humanity had been ignored, mocked, erased from the empire's history. They had been called weak, forgotten, irrelevant. But they had watched. They had built. They had waited. And when the moment came, they did not need to shout. The galaxy listened to their silence. A communication channel opened across every imperial frequency at once. Not through their systems. Not through their protocols. It bypassed everything, reaching every screen, every speaker, every device on the planet. The image was clear and sharp. A single human figure stood in a dark uniform. No medals, no crown, no arrogance. Their face was calm, their eyes cold as stone. Their voice was steady, carrying the weight of centuries. "You believed you ruled this galaxy," the human said quietly. "You were wrong. We were here before your empires rose. We watched. We learned. And now, we are awake." The words echoed through the halls, through the streets, through the ships. No threats. No negotiations. Just a statement of truth. It wasn't war anymore. It was a reminder. The aliens had thought they were alone at the top. But they had only been standing under a sleeping giant. The council fell into silence. Some wept. Some knelt. Some stared at the floor, their pride bleeding out like water. The High Speaker looked at the screen one last time. The Terrans hadn't come to burn their cities or wipe out their people. They had simply taken back what they had allowed the Empire to borrow for too long. In that moment, he understood that resistance wasn't just useless, it was meaningless. Terran dropships descended through the thick clouds like iron rain, landing in the heart of the Imperial capital without firing a single shot. The streets went still. The soldiers did not resist. The people did not scream. Humanity didn't need to fight anymore. The Empire had already surrendered without saying a word. The admiral aboard the Terran flagship watched as the last golden banner of the alien empire lowered itself over the council tower. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply turned and gave the quiet command. Secure the star map. Stabilize the core worlds. This is just the beginning. His officers moved without hesitation. Humanity wasn't just taking the capital. Humanity was taking the galaxy. The High Speaker sank to his knees on the balcony, the wind from descending ships blowing against his golden robes. He had ruled for a lifetime. He had believed no one could ever challenge them. Now he was just another witness to the rise of something far greater. Humanity didn't conquer with flames. They conquered with inevitability. And in the silent night sky above the Empire, The Terran fleet hung like a promise the galaxy would never forget. A new power had risen, and it didn't need to ask permission. It was already theirs. The final whisper reached every corner of the Empire, soft as the void, cold as iron. We are awake. And with those words, the galaxy's rulers changed forever.